No? Where's the... It's good that we do a sound check. That everyone could be here, joining us here in person and online. This is going to be a great night. So the question always presents itself when we have one of these nights of TE Talks, why this particular guest or why this particular topic? And for politics, it's actually one of my favorite topics, especially as a rabbi, especially as a Jew, because it's actually a very Jewish idea that we might say that religion doesn't get political, but in Judaism for 2,000 years, we were engaged in the self-governance of our people. And that is what the Talmud is about. It's not about the commentary of the Torah, but it's about how to live a life, how to live a good life, how to tax people, how to help the poor, how to run a society. And so talking about politics is something that is quite natural for Jews, and also having a civil dialogue is something that also should be natural to Jews, but doesn't always happen the way we'd like for it to. So it's my pleasure to invite up our co-president, Robert Wittenstein, to introduce our speaker as we delve into a wonderful Jewish Georgia topic tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Max. So I am introducing tonight Greg Bluestein. And as all of the people in the audience know, and maybe everybody online knows, that Greg is a political reporter and an author who covers the governor's office and state politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He writes for the front page of the AJC. He contributes to the Political Insider blog and the Morning Jolt newsletter. In fact, you were the author of today's Morning Jolt, which I appreciated getting. He hosts the Politically Georgia podcast and is a frequent guest on local and national TV and radio programs. He is an MSNBC and a NBC news contributor, and he is the author of the about-to-be-released book called Flipped, which is a book that talks about how Georgia went from red to purple, and maybe even a little blue, but at least purple. He's a proud graduate of the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. He has degrees in journalism and political science. He and his wife and his two daughters live in Dunwoody. He is a member of B'nai Torah, just around the corner from us. And he actually went to preschool in this building, way, way back. So he is one of us, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce Greg Bluestein.
It is really cool being back at where I went to preschool. I remember I was here from 2 years old to kindergarten, and I still remember the 11 Alive newscopter flying down. Back then they used to go visit schools, and they flew into our parking lot right out here, and we were on the end of the 11 Alive newscast, and I was looking for I remember those old shots where the helicopter would kind of float away and take a picture of all the kids waving. I was one of those kids. I loved it here, and many of I still have good friends, Cindy Cohn, Douglas Bornstein, David Binsminger, all these kids that I went to country school with here, who I still keep in touch with and are still members of the Atlanta Jewish community, which is really neat. Side note, Cindy Cohn, who I met here, she is a 5th grade teacher at Emanu-El Elementary School, and she is now not exactly my daughter's teacher, but one of the teachers in my daughter's cohort, so it's really fun seeing all that. As mentioned, the book Flipped comes out in about 10 days, which is surreal because I finished it probably in September or October and really finalized it in December. So it doesn't capture some of the most recent stuff because it's a book and it's permanent. So it doesn't capture David Perdue getting in the race. But at that point, we kind of thought he was. So I was kind of alluding to it throughout the book. What I hope to do today here is talk about 20, 30 minutes and then open up to questions because I love answering your questions. So I'll talk about the book and also talk about what's happening right now in Georgia politics because the book kind of frames it that way. I wish I did, but I did not set out in 2020 to write this book because I didn't know what would happen. And frankly, we all thought Republicans would probably win. It's just the conventional wisdom. As close as Stacey Abrams got in 2018, she still lost. And in 2020, Republicans had all sorts of advantages, including a lot of enthusiasm at the top of the ticket for David Perdue and money for Kelly Loeffler and energy and all that. And it was after the November election when an agent called me, probably around Thanksgiving, and said, "Hey, have you thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Not really. I'm right in the middle of like the biggest runoff in Georgia's history, probably the nation's history right now. But tell me about it." And he said, "Well, it would require you writing even more and drafting a book proposal and putting together an idea about what you'd want to say in this book." And at the time, it was a crazy weekend. It was Trump was about to come in for his first rally post-presidency in early December, and then I was about to moderate the only runoff debate that took place. David Perdue was a no-show, as you remember, but John Ossoff showed up beside an empty lectern, and then later on it was Kelly Loeffler versus Raphael Warnock. So I had to devote all my attention to all that. And it ended up being watched by something like 6 million people because it was simulcast on both CNN and Fox News, a rarity in these days for anything statewide, right? That's how important that race was. But after that, I started focusing on writing the book and writing the book proposal, and I just couldn't stop. The words are flowing because I've been covering this stuff since I graduated from college, really before I graduated from college in 2004, and I felt like I was uniquely able to tell it. At UGA, I covered Brian Kemp's state Senate run in 2002. I sat next to his campaign manager in one of my political science classes with Charles Bullock. I've covered Stacey Abrams since she was a backbench lawmaker about 12 years ago. I've covered John Ossoff since he broke the news to me on January 5th, 2017, that he was running for U.S. House. And I said, "Who are you? Who is this guy?" He goes, "I've got $250,000 in endorsements from Hank Johnson and John Lewis." I said, "Okay, you're legit." And then not that long after that, I came here to attend one of his first events where he was doing a meet and greet with local voters in the 6th District. I've covered David Perdue since he's launched his campaign for U.S. Senate and got to meet and then cover Kelly Loeffler because she was kind of unknown to me until I started reporting about how she was likely to be Governor Kemp's pick for this seat. So I think the major factor that underrides all my reporting is that this wasn't some miracle overnight by Democrats. It was a steady, laborious process that took years in the making. It was basically a decade-long process that began in part with Stacey Abrams taking the leadership of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. And it also took an enormous amount of energy and effort from volunteers and advocates on the ground, from voters. And in no small part, too, it wasn't as if Republicans were caught sleeping. And so it was Republican energy as well that helped Brian Kemp win in 2018 and almost stymied the entire flip. My career trajectory begins at the Hebrew Academy when in 4th grade, the Braves beat writer I.J. Rosenberg came to my class. I don't remember what he said. I don't remember what his message was. All I remember was going home and telling my mom that I wanted to be a journalist. And then she warned me that meant I had to type. And so I said, never mind, I might want to do something easier like be a doctor. So for the next 5 or 6 years, I convinced myself I was going to go into medicine, even though I was really bad in all my science and health classes. And I got like a 2 in AP physics and a 2 in AP chemistry. So someone was trying to tell me that I'm not really cut out for this. But at North Springs High School, my junior year, my best friend Jessica Schiffman was a year younger than me, and we used to always hang out after cross-country practice. And I was hanging at her house, and her dad worked for CNN, James Schiffman. He was a producer there. And he came running downstairs saying, "Breaking news is happening. It's all hands on deck on CNN. You want to come to the office with me?" And Jessica kind of rolled her eyes. "Dad, we're watching MTV or whatever we were doing." And I said, "No, let's do it. Let's do it." So I went to CNN with them. It was the Kosovo bombings in 1998. It was one of the last big conflicts, and much smaller than today's conflict, but one of the last big conflicts in Eastern Europe with Russia and U.S. at the verge of brinksmanship. And CNN was all hands on deck. And I just fell in love with journalism all over again, and then came back home and was determined to go into this field. And I joined the Oracle, which is the North Springs student newspaper. And then shortly after that, I went to the UGA, joined the Red and Black right after my first semester freshman year, and just soaked up every opportunity I could get, every internship I could get. I interned for Appin Newspapers, which is which owns Dunwoody Crier now, right? I interned for them. I interned for the Savannah Morning News. I interned for the Wall Street Journal in D.C. I interned for the Associated Press. I interned for the Atlanta Journal. And each of them taught me different lessons. And after I graduated and after my AP internship, I couldn't, I was promised a job to stay on with the AP, but they were going through internal turmoil. So instead I got a job at the Daily Report, covering legal, covering court cases, covering courtrooms. And to be a 21-year-old recent college grad, now suddenly writing for lawyers, because that's what the Daily Report's audience is. It's not a mass audience like the AP or the AJC. You are writing for a very, very narrow, but very niche audience of attorneys. And instead of writing maybe a 300-word story about a court case, you were writing 10,000-word stories sometimes about court cases, or at least 3,000-word stories about court cases. That's where I got to meet a lot of legal minds. That's where I got to meet Lin Wood for the first time, long before he became the Lin Wood of notoriety. And that's where I got to cover the legislature for the first time. And I fell in love with it. I just loved covering politics. At the AP over the next 7 years, I got to cover some politics, but mostly legal. I was the guy who they'd call to go to the mine explosion in West Virginia, or to go cover the hurricanes in Mississippi, or to go cover natural disasters. I went to Haiti with President Carter. I was kind of all over the place, and I had a go kit in my car at all times because they could call me at any minute. So sometimes it was down in Southwest Georgia, sometimes it was somewhere in Louisiana. I had a blast, but it was before I was married, but it was before I had kids. And I realized that if I wanted to be my kids' soccer coach or basketball coach over at the JCC, or right now I'm a makeshift softball coach. I'm not very good at it because I cheer on the kids too much. The other coaches are like, you have to give them instruction. You can't just say they're doing great every time, but that's me. But I realized if I wanted to do that, actually, I'm your granddaughter's coach. Yeah, Sarah. She's very good sometimes. But I realized if I wanted to do that, I couldn't keep the job at the Associated Press the way I was doing it because it was kind of nonstop. So the AJC called me. I worked for about 6 months as the commercial real estate reporter and loved it because I love covering business and economic development. I got to write about the State Farm deal that, now the new campus. I got to cover Porsche and all the development up here. But at some point, one of the editors pulled me aside and said, we want you covering politics. It's not really your choice, but we'll pretend it is. And I said, I'm all in. And the job has completely changed, but I've also got to completely see the complete metamorphosis of Georgia over the years. If you think about it, in 2014, that was the first major campaign I covered for the AJC. Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn were the nominees. They both lost by about 8 points to Nathan Deal and David Perdue, respectively. But back then, Democrats were a much more moderate blend. And Jason and I talk about this all the time because I still talk to him regularly. But back then, he had what he calls a but-and campaign. He felt like he had to reach out to moderate Democratic voters, but also try to be liberal, try to energize the base. What came out in the media, though, more was his moderate streak. He called himself an NRA Democrat, and he advocated for expanding gun rights. He endorsed gay marriage, but it was like days before the election. His campaign mostly revolved around expanding Medicaid and around the Hope Scholarship, which was the traditional message for Democrats. When Barack Obama, of course, was the president, then when he came to town, Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn were nowhere to be found because back then it was seen as kind of a death knell if you showed up with the president, a Democratic president in the middle of a campaign. And really, we wrote about it, but no one was shocked because that was this conventional strategy. And we've seen that strategy kind of be turned on its ears. In 2014, as I said, Jason and Michelle Nunn lost by about 8 points. In 2016 was the giant shock. I spent most of that year traveling all around the nation, in Ohio, and New Hampshire, and Texas, and Nevada, and everywhere, covering the presidential campaign through a Georgia lens, writing about the Georgians who were volunteering and who were active all over, because the race was not here. Yes, okay. Is that better? Sorry. The race was not here. Neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump even visited Georgia after the primaries. Georgia was not a competitive state. It was not seen as a battleground whatsoever. So my story was where they were. So I would go to Florida with Hillary Clinton, and I'd go to North Carolina with Donald Trump and write about it through a Georgia lens. But the shock when we woke up after that election day was not that Donald Trump won, because we all expected him to win, at least in Georgia, maybe not nationally, but in Georgia. And he won Georgia by 5 points. But the shock was that he lost Gwinnett County, Henry County, and Cobb County, and particularly Cobb County being the sort of backbone of the Republican Party, the incubator of the Gingrich Revolution, the launching pad for Johnny Isakson. For that district was Tom Price's district, and that was the sort of wake-up call that, hey, the suburbs are beginning to flip, and hey, we've got a front row seat to that, living right here, living in this area. And that's where John Ossoff comes in, and that's kind of where Flipped, in a sense, begins. I write a lot about Stacey Abrams and her trying to lead the resistance in 2017 and becoming more of it was hard to see Stacey Abrams, if you knew her in the state legislature. She was always in judiciary committees, always kind of poking holes at Republican bills because she'd see legal flaws in them, and she'd question them very pointedly. But she was not seen as this charismatic speaker that she is today. It was hard to actually imagine her as that because I don't think even she saw herself as that. I think she at one point said, if I had to, if I could cry, I would. She was very brusque, right? At one of her first events, she talked about how uncomfortable she was. She's very introverted, and she talked about how uncomfortable she was being in the audience, going to the grocery store, being recognized. She had to fill that role. She had to get accustomed to that to become the leader of the party that she is now. John Ossoff was a little bit like that too, just coming out of nowhere with those endorsements, with that early cash, coming to events like this. Right here, or I guess it was right over there, wherever the event was at the social hall, I asked him, he was just starting to get national attention, and I asked him, just kind of, sometimes you ask like a disarming question. It wasn't meant as a gotcha, but I asked him, what's something that, because we were just getting to know him as a candidate. I said, what's something strange about you? What's something unique about you that people wouldn't ascribe to you at all? And he paused for about a good 10 seconds and said, I'll get back to you on that. To me, that was John's way of, that was Senator Ossoff's way of he was trying to become a candidate. He was trying to learn the ropes. I asked him about that for the book, actually, later on. I said, why didn't you, that was such a gimme question. I just was curious about some quirk, you like reading science fiction, whatever. And he said, I just did not want to fall into a trap. He knew at the time that his every word, this was very early in that 2017 campaign, but he knew at the time that every word would be dissected, there was trackers following him, there was conservative outlets that were writing up everything he said in a negative view, and he was getting himself ready for what was to come. That campaign was so fascinating because, as I said, in 2016, I was all around the country. In 2017, I barely had to move I could walk to events. I could walk here. I could walk to the Starbucks around the corner where there was Democratic meetups. The guy who owned the jewelry shop over on Ashford Dunwoody, Bruce Lavelle, was a Republican running for Congress. So I would see him when I go to the Supercuts to get my hair cut, right? And so suddenly we went from traveling the nation to being able to be right here and have the biggest story in the nation right here. And it was really a prelude to what was to come. But I go into great detail in my book about the 6th District race in 17 because it was so formative, not just for John Ossoff, but for Republicans as well, as they learned to deal with Trump in the Trump era. Karen Handel was this sort of anti-establishment candidate all through her career. She was always kind of fighting against the masculine sort of chauvinistic political machine at the Capitol as one of the first women in statewide office, certainly first Republican women in statewide office in Georgia. And she had to become this establishment candidate. On the flip side, we saw John Ossoff start the campaign as a make Trump furious candidate who was going to stick it to Donald Trump, and then morph into a very moderate, very cautious candidate who wouldn't even say Donald Trump's name by the end, was very wary of talking about liberal policies, would never answer the question about whether he'd support Nancy Pelosi or not. And, of course, came very close to winning this outright in the first round of voting. He got 48% of the vote and then lost in the second round of the voting to Karen Handel. And he'd tell you he learned a lot of lessons from that campaign, but one of them was to be authentic. And I went out with him at the end of the year. He called me and he said, I'm doing an event, I think it was in Toccoa or Stevens County somewhere. Very Republican county, very few Democrats there, but every Democrat in that county showed up to this event. And that's where he tested out a more liberal message, a populist message about ending paying back student loans and going after corporate greed. And to me, that was his test case for the Jon Ossoff that I think he really is. I think he had to sort of pretend to be the more moderate Jon Ossoff that we saw in 2017, and the Jon Ossoff we're seeing now is probably the true Jon Ossoff. But that 2017 race and that authentic, realization was basically what fueled Stacey Abrams in 2018, because she was not pretending to be a Republican light. She embraced gun control. She talked openly and often about fighting abortion restrictions, decriminalizing marijuana, even talking about taking the Confederate faces off Stone Mountain, right? She also talked about broad-based issues, expanding Medicaid, more school funding, those types of things as well. Those probably underpinned her campaign. But her argument was that we'll win the middle. Democrats will win the middle if they can energize their core. And frankly, that was the Republican case too. You did not see Brian Kemp, Casey Cagle, Hunter Hill, any of the Republican candidates move to the middle at all. They were energizing their base as well with guns, with religious liberty, with a lot of culture wars issues that we're still seeing today. But with Stacey Abrams' near miss, 55,000 votes or so away from Brian Kemp, it proved to Democrats that there was a path forward by veering to the left. Not necessarily always staying in that lane, but by appealing to the core audiences, especially in the Trump era. And we only saw that sort of path accelerate after her defeat. Because in 2020, with both Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff running for Senate in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of the push for social justice movement, in the middle of all the things we lived through, which is amazing sometimes just to think back at 2020 and what an epic year is. We say in the AJC newsroom that any one of those stories, the pandemic, social justice movements, and the elections, any one of those could have been like the stories of our lifetime. And we had all three at the same time that we all survived. So I guess we deserve a round of applause. But the crazy part, that just thinking back at just covering the pandemic at the beginning, was that every story we were writing, we all had to become science reporters. I'm a political reporter. I told you how bad I did in AP chemistry. And I suddenly was writing about pandemic policies. Our sports reporters, put down their pens because there was nothing to write about, and instead started writing about the pandemic. Features reporters, science features reporters, and local government reporters, and everyone had to become a science reporter. And that, of course, colored the entire campaign as well, as candidates struggled to reach out to voters, to figure out new ways to interact. And that's when we saw Senator Warnock, now back then Raphael Warnock, Pastor Warnock, emerge as a candidate. He is very close to Stacey Abrams. She helped clear the field for him. He still faced opposition from other Democrats, but she helped make sure that there was no big name Democrats getting in the race, because the party backed Raphael Warnock early on. But it wasn't some easy race for him, right? He would go to events early on in 2020 where there'd be crowds of 3 or 4 people, where the local mayor was by far the biggest draw, where county commissioners would get more questions and more requests for selfies than Raphael Warnock. He had to learn how to be a candidate in the middle of a pandemic when his best quality, probably, or one of his best qualities, is the ability to go reach out to an audience and have that sort of interaction. Instead, he was on a Zoom call, waiting for the applause, and he couldn't hear it. It was very tough for him, as it was for a lot of candidates. But what, of course, he benefited from is this wild, completely open special election to replace Johnny Isakson that pitted 2 Republicans against each other, Doug Collins, of course, and Kelly Loeffler. Both of them being not very well known to the broader electorate, but both of them becoming, by the end of it, extremely, extremely well known. It was the most expensive Senate contests in the nation's history. And I would drag my kids on the campaign trail with me, because it was the pandemic. They weren't really in school. And so I'd make them do, they were in school, but they were doing virtual school. So I'd make them do YouTube videos. So they created something called Bluestein Blogs, and they'd go around with me, and they met John Ossoff. They got to interview Ossoff. They got to interview, I think I brought Sarah. I think I brought your granddaughter to one of them. But they interviewed Ossoff and Warnock and Perdue and Loeffler. But I remember one time, right near the end of the campaign, I brought them to an event with Kelly Loeffler, and we were at some restaurant in Carrollton. And by then the campaign knew my kids because they had seen my two daughters at like 5 or 6 other events. What kind of dad am I? And so they were very well known to all these candidates. And so they asked, hey, do your daughters want to ask Kelly, Senator Loeffler, a question? And I said, sure, of course they do. So we went back, and their question was something about, why are all these ads about radical liberal Raphael Warnock, and what's the purpose of all these ads? Because they were nonstop at the time. And literally, as my daughter was asking that question, the ad showed up on a TV screen, and Kelly Loeffler kind of pointed at it and just verbatim said whatever she was saying on the TV screen, even to a 9-year-old girl and a 6-year-old girl. So that was how in tune the messaging was. But you saw the Republican rift play out in such a huge way over Donald Trump's campaign lies about widespread voting fraud. And, part of what I write about in this book is the Republican frustration. Kelly Loeffler couldn't distance herself at all from Donald Trump. Neither could David Perdue. And so they struggled throughout, especially that runoff period, of trying to placate the then president, while at the same time trying to energize their base and keep Trump voters in the fold. There was one rally in Dalton where it was about 90 minutes of a rally where he spoke about the candidates for about maybe 3 minutes of the entire time. And right after the rally, I talked to some of his aides, some of Kelly Loeffler's aides, and one of them said, "We got 3 minutes. At least we got that." I mean, that was how rough it was for the Republicans who were trying to energize their base, but still had to deal with the entire Trump effect. Meanwhile, Democrats doing that entire runoff campaign could kind of divorce themselves, distance them. You didn't hear them attacking Trump too much. They were talking about their policies. They were talking about what became the American Rescue Plan. They were talking about more robust paychecks and stimulus checks for Americans. And at the same time, they were trying to stay out of the Republican infighting as much as possible. One of the things I capture in the book too is January 5th, the moment when the state flips, right? The moment when both these elections go Democratic way. And I talked to John Ossoff about what he does on election nights. And it's very different from what other candidates do. He likes to sort of meditate. He likes to sit near a fireplace and stay away from the aides, because really in campaigns, there's nothing you can do the day of an election, really. You go out there and you do some media, but by then the kind of cake is already baked. And talking to all these candidates about their processes and their emotions and their how they handle the most stressful moments of their life was really fascinating. But what really stuck out with talking to Democrats about that day was how short-lived their celebration was. Because this was supposed to be the most epic day for Democrats in Georgia that you can imagine, right? They flipped 2 Senate races on the same day that flipped control of the U.S. Senate and gave Joe Biden the ability to pursue a much more expansive agenda. And instead, of course, January 6th was marked by the insurrection. We at the AJC were planning a huge front page piece all about how momentous these elections were and what it meant and what it signified in history and all that. And then my story that was supposed to be stripped across the top barely made it on the front page, of course, for good reason, because of the insurrection. And those are issues that are still playing out. But one of them was with Kelly Loeffler. When she had agreed to Donald Trump, she had told Donald Trump that she would vote to hold up the certification. It was something that he had demanded repeatedly, and it was something that only she could do because of a quirk of law. David Perdue was not in office. His term expired a few days earlier. So Kelly Loeffler was the only U.S. senator at the time. A big weird flaw in Georgia law in runoff. So Kelly Loeffler is at the Capitol, and she's when the insurrection's starting, and she's hustled down with other senators to the basement of the U.S. Capitol, where there's senators watching, huddled around CNN. There's audible groans when Donald Trump gets on air and basically praises some of the members of that violent mob. And at that point, she kind of told herself, there's nothing I could do to stop this, to stop Joe Biden from getting elected. So I'm going to flip-flop, And so she did. And at that moment, she also complicated the rest of her political career, because whenever she decides to run for office, and I believe she will, I think she'll probably run for governor or something again, but Republican Trump supporters will say that she betrayed the president the former president, by changing her mind on whether or not to block that vote. But I also wanted to paint a picture, too, of all that's happened since, in Georgia politics, since that January 5th runoff. It gave Joe Biden a far more expansive agenda. Joe Biden came here on the 100-day anniversary of his, the 100-day, to mark the first 100 days of his administration, where he talked about, more expansive coronavirus testing, and vaccines are coming, and all that stuff. But also, at the same time, Republicans are more energized. This is before the inflation and before the other issues that we're seeing right now, but Governor Kemp used to be roundly booed every Republican event he'd go to, it seemed. He was booed in Savannah for the Georgia GOP convention. He's been booed at grassroots meetings. But when he passed and signed into law SB 202, which was the election rewrite bill, it seemed to help steady his fortunes with other Republicans. And to this day, right now, he's in a pretty decent position. You never count David Perdue out. Donald Trump is sending in reinforcements. Donald Trump Jr. was just here a few days ago. Trump is hosting a fundraiser for David Perdue next week. Trump is going to host a rally for him probably in a couple weeks. I know the date, but I'm not sure it's locked down exactly yet. So there's going to be more Trump reinforcements for David Perdue. He is not down and out yet, but at this moment, Brian Kemp is looking pretty good. He literally qualified for office today in front of hundreds of supporters. It was a striking contrast from David Perdue, who qualified for office yesterday with an entourage of maybe his staffers, and that's about it. Visuals aren't everything in politics, but they do say a lot. And right now, Governor Kemp, it looks like we could be heading towards a rematch between Governor Kemp and Stacey Abrams. Georgia is still going to be in the middle of the spotlight. Georgia is definitely the premier battleground state in 2022, but it might just be the premier battleground state for the rest of the decade. The top officials from both parties don't see Georgia going solid blue or solid red anytime soon. Doesn't seem like Georgia's going to go Virginia's way, Virginia flipped too for Republicans, but it doesn't seem like it's going to go take a hard left turn or a hard right turn. Seems like Georgia is destined for very close political races over the next few years, and that means we're in the middle of it all. That means more ads, that means more opportunities to volunteer, that means a lot more attention on Georgia. Just in the last few weeks, the Washington Post, New York Times, and I think now Politico are all hiring reporters just to cover Georgia, which is something that 5 or 6 years ago would be unimaginable. We were such a backwater. There was events in 2014, 2016 in Georgia, even 2018. There'd be events with Stacey Abrams where she said, "Greg, I might as well just have this in your office. You're the only reporter here." Let me put it to contrast to that. 2 days ago when she qualified, there was a reporter from Japan and a reporter from Switzerland at the state capitol to cover her qualifying for office. So we are in the thick of things here, for better or for worse. But it's really been fascinating. And it's an opportunity for all of us, too, to get more involved in politics, to get more knowledgeable about the issues, and to help shape the direction of our state. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, there's so many opportunities to get involved and to meet these candidates, because John Ossoff was here. It's funny, but John Ossoff, he was here for Yom Kippur, but he was also here as a newbie candidate not so long ago, where, that is part of my job as a reporter, is to meet the candidates before they become the big shots. But it's neat seeing, local voters get that opportunity as well. As I said, Georgia's the center of the political attention. We have down ticket races that would be the biggest election in other states. The race for for Secretary of State here in Georgia is going to get outsized attention because Brad Raffensperger is in the fight of his life. I saw an internal poll just today that showed him about 9 points back behind Jody Hice, who's Trump's endorsed candidate in that race. Georgia's also going to be probably the biggest test case in the nation for Trump's influence going forward. It's going to help determine a lot of his clout in 2024 should he decide to run for president again, which I think he will. I don't have any inside info. It's just what he keeps on saying he will. But think about it. He's endorsed 5 candidates in Georgia. He's endorsed Herschel Walker, of course, but Herschel would be doing well even without his endorsement. He's Herschel Walker. He scared away everyone else from running, even before Trump endorsed him. But he's also endorsed David Perdue, who's struggling in the polls and lagging in fundraising, but still could make a comeback. He's endorsed Burt Jones, who's a candidate for lieutenant governor and a former Georgia football player, who is also in a really tough battle for lieutenant governor against a Republican named Butch Miller. He's endorsed Jody Hice, as I mentioned, against Brad Raffensperger, and he's endorsed Vernon Jones, who used to be our DeKalb CEO, liberal Democrat, who is a former Democratic state lawmaker, who about a year ago formally switched parties to the Republican Party. But he broke the news to me that he was endorsing Trump, and it was about 2 years ago, and it was right at the start of the pandemic. So I remember I was in the basement, my kids were screaming upstairs about something, as they usually are. And my wife works for a hospital, so she was always at the hospital, and I was usually at home, right? So I get a call from one of Vernon's aides, and I got a call from a Republican strategist who said, "Hey, I've got some big news for you. There's going to be a Democratic lawmaker who's going to endorse Trump." And I said, "When is Vernon going to do it?" You know, it was instantly knew that it had to be Vernon Jones because he had alienated so many of his Democratic colleagues, and he was such a, I guess the right word is character. I don't know, but he has quite the personality, and made himself a pariah to Democrats. But Vernon Jones was running for governor and was trying to get Donald Trump's endorsement. And when that became clear that wasn't going to happen, he saw the polls that showed him at 8%, which is enough to give trouble to both Perdue and to Kemp, and extracted a major concession out of Donald Trump, which is, I will drop out of the race if you endorse me to run for Congress. So now Vernon Jones is running for the 10th congressional district out in rural northeast Georgia, a district where he doesn't live, a district about an hour away from here, and a district that is very rural, very white, very, very, very conservative. And he's running against about a dozen other candidates. So to me, that race is probably the biggest test of Donald Trump's influence in the entire nation, because if Donald Trump's endorsement helps a former DeKalb County CEO who was a Democrat until a year ago win a probably 70% Republican district where he doesn't live, then that shows you Donald Trump still has a lot of juice. But there is a big question about that. There's huge concerns among Republicans who are relying on his endorsement that his sway is starting to wane. And we'll see very, very soon, in May 24th, about 2 months from now, whether or not Donald Trump's influence, his clout, still is as strong as it is. And we'll also, of course, answer so many other questions in this race. That's why I like this job. It's being able to outline the questions and then start to answer them once we see the votes come in, and help share the story of the direction that the state is going and all the fun political stories that populate the state. I'd love to hear your questions, too, about what concerns and what issues that you're watching at the Capitol that I can help out with, because we're right in the middle of a very busy legislative session. Yeah.
Georgia has had some embarrassing characters representing us over the years. Cynthia McKinney certainly comes to mind, but nobody seems to top Marjorie Taylor Greene. Can anybody beat her?
The other question is, can anyone beat Marjorie Taylor Greene? I write about her a lot in my book because I first met her at the Alons down the street. She was running as a conservative Republican, but not a far-right conservative Republican, against Karen Handel. That was her goal. She was going to defeat Karen Handel. She was going to criticize Karen Handel's votes for the budget and other sort of establishment views. And within a few weeks, we found out about some of her videos and some of her history, but we still didn't know the whole story. But frankly, we also, not just at the AJC, but also she was kind of seen as an also-ran, right? She wasn't going to be, Karen Handel had a lot of money and the power of incumbency, so there wasn't much attention being paid to Marjorie Taylor Greene's campaign at the time. That all changed when she decided to run for that open seat up in Northwest Georgia, where she already had a ready-made campaign operation here in the 6th District that she could just shift to Northwest Georgia. And she ran in relentless ads on radio up there and very provocative messaging, and started getting national attention, which I think probably ended up helping her. I think also when one of the standout moments of that campaign was me covering her victory party in 2020 in August. She beat a neurosurgeon named John Cowan, and I went to her victory party in Rome and kind of identified myself as a reporter and sat in the back of a room. In the middle of her speech, she kicked me out and then tweeted about me. That's how she approaches the media. That's how she's approached me as a reporter who's just trying to tell the story of what's happening. But she's built up incredible name recognition. She has millions of dollars in her campaign war chest. It is a very conservative district. Republican lawmakers tweaked it a little bit because there's not many fans of hers down at the State House. So they redrew the districts just enough to make her life a little bit more difficult. They added South Cobb County precincts that are very, very blue to her district, and she's very unhappy with that. I wrote a big story about that right after it happened. But it shouldn't change the ball game. I mean, that is still a very Republican district, one of the most Republican-leaning districts east of the Mississippi. And the best bet for Republicans is finding a candidate in the primary who can defeat her. And there's 3 or 4 of them who lined up just this week to face her. It's very unique. Qualifying in Georgia is strange because it's the formal process. It's a 5-day process where you sign up to run for office. And it's on the 2nd floor of the Capitol, so it's in the middle of the legislative session. And on one side, you've got Democrats. On the other side, you've got Republicans. And Monday is the busiest day. And so on Monday, you had all these congressmen come and line up. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was, I think, 2nd in line. And maybe the 4th in line was one of her opponents, Jennifer Strahan. And the 5th in line was one of her other opponents. And so only in qualifying do you have candidates who are bitter rivals kind of bumping into each other in the middle of the hallways. So look, there's other Republicans in the race. They might even get endorsements and some money behind them. But Marjorie Taylor Greene's got such high name recognition. She's got the power of incumbency. And she's got millions of dollars, mostly from out of state, behind her. It's really tough for a Republican to beat her. There are Democrats in the race too. I interviewed all 3 of the 4 or 5 of them over the last couple days. And there's one in particular, Marcus Flowers, who's raised a lot of money as well. But in that district, you'd have to rely on a huge amount of crossover Republican votes who are just disgusted with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I felt like personally at the AJC, it's hard to cover everything she does because we only have so many reporters, but I felt like her appearance last weekend at a pro-Putin white nationalist rally kind of raised the bar, and that was kind of a new threshold, and so we reported on that and the fallout, and it's kind of taken this predictable pattern. She gets reprimanded or not reprimanded. She gets condemned by some Republicans. Others just say that in general, they don't agree with the message, but there's never been a formal reprimand from Republicans, at least. She got stripped of her committee assignments, but that was by the House. The Republican minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, said that he'd have a conversation with her, but that's kind of like, it's like a go to your room type of a slap on the wrist. Mitt Romney said that he feels bad that he's in a room with morons, but that was about as harsh as it got. Has there been any real repercussions, right? Is she getting sanctioned or censured or anything? No. But her go-to response to that is that I'm being canceled. And that has a particular resonance with conservative voters who, there's a reason candidates keep on talking about woke and cancel culture, because it works. And because there is a significant part of the electorate that is worried about being canceled and being minimized and marginalized.
Greg, what impact is the new voter restriction laws going to have on the 2022 elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by the way, there's more voting laws that just voting proposals, election-related proposals that were just introduced this week in the Capitol. So you'll see a lot more news about it. If it went so far as to ban ballot drop boxes and to ban no-excuse absentee voting, you'd be talking about hundreds of thousands of votes that could be obstacles to votes that would affect hundreds of thousands. Instead, this is affecting a lot of voters, but really, even what Democrats will often say, maybe sometimes privately, is that it's voters on the margins, in a sense. Like, we're talking about thousands of votes. There are new requirements for voter ID for absentee ballots. There are new deadlines for requesting absentee ballots. There's new limits on ballot drop boxes. There won't be as many, right? There's new limits on grants that will be used for mobile voting sites and things like that. What it really will affect is if there's another race like we had with Trump versus Biden, where it's decided by 11,000 votes. Races that close, you could really see. We were able to track in the mayoral race at the AJC how many voters missed the deadline for absentee ballots and then never ended up voting, and because there's new deadlines to request those ballots. And it was something like 60% of the voters who missed that deadline never ended up casting a ballot. So when you look at, and that was not a huge number of voters overall, we're talking a few thousand voters, but when you're talking about a very close race that could be decided by 11,000 votes, if you have another replay of what happened in 2018, 55,000 votes, that's when you get, and that's 55,000 gap between Abrams and Kemp, but it's a much smaller gap to get into the runoff, right? Abrams wasn't going for the win when she was requesting that more provisional ballots be counted. She was going for the runoff because that was more of a gap of, if she made up 20,000 votes or so, she would have gotten to her, forced a runoff with Kemp. And when you're talking about margins that close, yeah, this measure matters. Overall, though, it's a new obstacles to vote, and Democrats are worried that in general it intimidates, it sends the wrong message to voters who aren't paying attention as much, sort of lower information voters that aren't following every twist and turn of the laws. And they're worried about having the same message that they had doing 2020, which is get a plan to vote, right? Request an absentee ballot, vote early, vote on election day, but have a plan so that you're not kind of caught unaware, and that you've at least tried before election day, because we don't know how long lines will be at certain polling places. And we certainly know that a lot of people can't wait in line for 6 hours to vote. And we definitely saw that in the primary in 2020, where I was at Cross Keys High School, and there was voters who were out there for hours, in an unmoving line. And they were staying there in part to deliver a message. They were going to stay, they were going to exercise their First Amendment right to vote. But it was very difficult. It was hard as a reporter to cover, because you had people who were, 80-year-old, 83-year-olds who were bringing their chairs out with them to vote, and they were bringing coolers full of drinks and food because they knew they would have to sit there for 5 or 6 hours just to cast their ballot. And I know it's sort of an anomaly. There was precincts all over Georgia that didn't have any problems, but there was a lot of precincts that did. That wasn't the only one. And that was a failing of our system. And that was something that we at the AJC and that demanded changes for, and of course voters demanded changes. And we saw them. We saw a much more smoother situation in November. But we're worried about a replay of that, right? We're worried that voters who haven't been paying attention to every twist and turn, who aren't that familiar with the new regime, and who aren't that familiar with what districts they're in now. I'm in a new district. I used to be in 6th district. Now I'm in the 5th. Mike Walensky used to be my state rep. Now I'm in a different state rep district. Now I'm in Shay Roberts' district in the Newland. So there's going to be a lot of voter confusion, and people are going to have a lot of patience. And this new voting law is another kind of wrinkle to all that.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for being here, Greg. You alluded to down-ticket races that are somewhat energized by Stacey Abrams' appearance on the ballot again. And I was thinking of 3 state senators, Democratic state senators, that are leaving the state Senate. Jen Jordan for Attorney General, Michelle Ahn, I can't remember which office she's running for, and Matthew Wilson running for insurance commissioner. It's only recently that Democrats have been able to break the supermajority the Republicans held in the state Senate. Are they setting themselves up to fall further behind if these candidates are unsuccessful?
Yeah, that's a good question, because redistricting, we were talking about it a little bit earlier before the program started, but Republicans, to me at least, kind of played it safe with the redistricting. They could have pushed for instance, they could have pushed for additional two U.S. House seats. They could have tried to draw both the 6th and the 7th district as Republican leaning. Instead, they went for the safe bet. They drew the 6th district all the way from around here, all the way up to Dawson County. So the 6th district ends closer to Tennessee than it is to Atlanta. And that was done for a purpose. It was drawn so conservatively that Lucy McBath said, you know what? I'm going to take my ball and go run in the 7th district instead, where I actually have a chance. And there's no credible Democrat running in the 6th district now. It will be a Republican-held seat. But they could have tried to draw the 7th district Republican too. And they might have done it. They might have actually flipped both those seats Republican this cycle. But the worry for Republicans is the long game, right? You can't redraw the districts until 2021. 2031, geez. So the concern was that if they redraw both those districts, they wouldn't hold in 2024 or 2026, and you'd have a situation like you have right now with the entire northern arc going blue. So instead they went for the safe one. It's very hard to see a chance of the 6th district flipping back even in 2028, given the current demographic patterns. But the 7th district is as blue as it's ever been, right? That's not a swing district anymore. So you have that situation right there. But in the state legislature, Republicans took a similar tack. They could have gone for even bigger majorities, but instead they kind of held back, especially in the House. In the House, Republicans are actually projected to lose probably 5 or 6 seats. In the Senate, they might actually lose 1, but they'll still maintain giant majorities in the Senate particularly. In the House, they'll have a little bit less cushion, but Republicans should have about 95, 96 seats in a 180-seat House, so a 5 or 6 seat advantage. It's a risky play, but Republicans see that their demographics are working against them, and there's nothing they can do about it. These sparsely populated rural districts down in South Georgia, they're being merged. They picked up a few seats in the exurbs for Forsyth County, Cherokee County, but not enough to keep pace with the Democratic-leaning seats in Gwinnett County, in Cobb County, that Democrats are picking up. So no, I don't think that, Michelle Awe, by the way, you mentioned Michelle Awe, she was actually drawn out of her district. So she's actually running for the state house. Jen Jordan's district should stay blue. There's among the candidates running for that seat is Jason Estevez, who's the former president of the Atlanta School Board, so he comes in with a lot of money and name recognition and institutional support. But it's going to be, what I'm watching is how Republicans respond to that. And next year, no matter the governor, David Ralston, the House Speaker for 20 years, how long is he? About 12 years now, he'll have a smaller majority. And as any legislative leader knows, you can't rely, it's hard to rely on every single member of that caucus. There's always some people who just vote no, for whatever reason they just vote no. So keeping that caucus together, right now it's a little easier. He has 105 or 106 seats. But when you have 96 seats and you need every single one of those votes, and someone's sick, and someone's tending to an ill family member, and someone's stuck in South Georgia because he has to work, because these are all working citizen legislators, it's a little bit harder for David Ralston to keep that coalition together. And it'll be really interesting to see if Stacey Abrams is the governor, how they all react to her push to expand Medicaid and other things that she'll try to do in a bipartisan manner.
This is another down question. Oh, thank you. This is another down ballot question. Talk a little bit about Brad Raffensperger. He's certainly no Trump darling, and he just seems like a complicated, kind of conflicted politician.
Yeah, it's a great way to describe him, complicated and conflicted. He's very conservative, right? He was basically a backbencher in 2018. I mean, someone that we barely covered in the legislature. I don't think I ever really wrote his name before he ran for Secretary of State. And even when he ran for Secretary of State, he was not looked at as the front runner at all. It was Josh McCoon. Josh McCoon was a very conservative Columbus state senator who pushed religious liberty, pushed a series of sort of culture wars positions, but also was the guy who would call out his own party on ethics violations, on things like that. He's fun to cover. I still talk to him all the time. He was the front runner, as it seemed, and there was 3 other Metro Atlanta lawmakers, including Brad Raffensperger, that was running for that seat. Well, Brad Raffensperger kind of waited back, held back the entire time, and then near the very end, pushed in a lot of money on TV ads, mindful that people were paying attention to the governor's race, maybe a little bit at lieutenant governor's race, but they weren't paying attention to the Secretary of State's race. And those TV ads helped him emerge from the pack and eventually win a runoff. And he spent a lot of his own money because he's very wealthy. When he took office, still had a very low profile, didn't really know how to deal with the media at first, didn't know how to, was adjusting to the job. It was before the Trump tape, but he started getting in trouble with his fellow party members when he reached an agreement with Democrats to postpone the primary, and then later on an agreement over counting, how to count absentee ballots during the pandemic, and opening the system to even more absentee ballots. Democrats took advantage of it, and not in a nefarious way. They just leveraged the opening of the absentee ballots and had record numbers of mail-in ballots. Republicans didn't, in part because of all the negative attitude that Donald Trump had. You know, he even before his 2016 election, he said there'd be millions of fake, fraudulent mail-in ballots, and that had an effect on the electorate. After the famous tape, and I'll never forget that day, but after the famous tape that came out the Sunday before the runoff, Brad Raffensperger had a choice, right? He knew he would be vilified by Trump the rest of the way out, right? Just like Brian Kemp did, but even more so in a sense. And he had a choice. He could decide to run for re-election as go kind of a middle path. He could just say, I'm done, and kind of go out as maybe a martyr in a sense. Or he could go kind of to the right, and he did in a sense. He has continued, his campaign strategy is hinged on, I stood up for what was right, I'm not going to buckle to Donald Trump, but also Stacey Abrams is the same way. And his attacks have been kind of dual like that. Even as he's criticized Donald Trump for trying to insist that he overturn the elections, he's also said that accused Stacey Abrams of pushing the same thing by not conceding in 2018. So, it actually came up the other day of some national media member was asking me, why aren't there many Democratic voters who are crossing over to vote for Brad Raffensperger? I said, well, Raffensperger's made an enemy out of Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight and all the groups aligned with her because he keeps on attacking her. And Democrats are making it very clear that Brad Raffensperger is not on the same page as them. I, not so long ago, thought Brad Raffensperger had no chance, that he wouldn't even qualify. It was just hard to see him, in a Republican primary, getting over the fact that Donald Trump has called him the most vulnerable Republican in Georgia. But in recent days, things have seemed to shift. He definitely qualified. He was one of the first people in line on Monday. He's still a pariah to many Republicans. I was standing in line just interviewing a Congress member who was about 4 feet away from Brad Raffensperger, and I made the joke that I was going to take a picture of the two of them, and he bolted. So there's still that among Republicans. He's still kind of an untouchable to some Republicans. You're not seeing him at many Republican events with other candidates. But I'll say it to this. He has gone out there. He is not hiding from his critics. He'll go to the Bullitt County GOP in very conservative parts of Georgia, and he'll stand up there and answer all the questions that he gets from many people who are pro-Trump. He'll go on John Frederick's radio show. It's a far-right commentator who is espousing many of the lies about the election fraud. He'll go on there for, one time he invited Fredericks to his office, and they sat there and talked for more than an hour on his radio show about all these claims and all these issues that those guys have. So he is appealing to the conservative base. And there was one internal poll that I recently saw that showed him about 9 points behind Jody Heiss. So he's still in the ballgame. That's still within striking distance. 30 points, you're done. But 9 points, you're still right there. So he is an enigmatic character. He is one of those. He is very wealthy, retired. He does not need to be doing this for his own ego. But at the same time, I think he wants to remedy his name a little bit, and that's part of why he's still in this race rather than going and, calling it quits like Jeff Duncan. Because Jeff Duncan could very well be in the same category right now. Jeff Duncan, the lieutenant governor, who also drew Donald Trump's wrath, decided, you know what, I'm not going to run again. And he wrote a book called GOP 2.0 that's all about moving forward in the post-Trump era. And it's also gotten even, every time he tweets or every time he talks, there's an element of his own party, including in the state Senate that he presides over, that vilify him and that feel like he's a fake Republican.
I'm going to give it to Jeff, but I'm going to ask a question first.
Yeah.
I have been a subscriber to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for many, many years.
Thank you for paying my salary.
And the Piper is changing in many ways. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how journalism and journalism in Atlanta are evolving.
Yeah, so part of it is this bio you read, right? Like, I would never have imagined when I graduated with a newspapers major from the University of Georgia. I was a newspapers and poli-sci major. They don't have that anymore, by the way. There's no newspapers majors anymore, thank goodness. But that the job would entail doing all those other things. But I'm not unique. That is the job now, right? As a journalist, you have to be comfortable talking to crowds, going on radio, doing TV appearances, blogging, newsletters. All the things that you mentioned are all things that are sort of part and parcel with the career now. It used to be very linear. At UGA, you were a newspapers major, a magazines major, a radio major, a TV major, a telecom major. Those were the sort of avenues you had, and there was very little overlap. I never took a TV course. I was all print journalism. The TV people, rarely ever went to the Red and Black and tried to write newspaper articles. Now TV personalities write often. They have blogs, they have newsletters. They're on air and they're writing, and vice versa, right? I got an NBC News contract, something I never thought I would ever get in this job, but that's part of the gig now. And places like the AJC encourage that because they know that that's the future of journalism. Print paper is still humming along. We no longer have our Gwinnett County publisher. That's out. Like, we used to have a printing press in Gwinnett County. Now we're published out in Gainesville, so that means our deadlines are even earlier. I think my deadline is something like 2 or 3. So if there's an event, let's say a debate, it's not getting into actual print paper. But frankly, that's something that we've been talking about for a long time at the AJC, is the need to continue moving digital. And our company is continuing to push print subscribers, encourage them to keep on subscribing for print, but also to look at the digital options, because most people around my age and younger still don't get the print newspaper. And that's a good thing. I'm okay with that, right? We want to be able to serve the audience where they're at and meet them where they're at. And a lot of them are in the phones right now, obviously. And so that's where we have with Twitter and with social media and with our newsletters and our blogs and our podcasts and all those things that come directly to the audience rather than waiting for them to find you. Press on. That's our campaign strategy.
How many political reporters were there 10 years ago? How many are there now?
So that's fascinating because at the state capitol, there was a time where it had devolved into just a handful of reporters. The AP, we drew back. They used to have 3 reporters in Atlanta. They went from 3 to 0 for a while. When I started, there was Columbus and Macon and Rome and Augusta and Athens and Valdosta all had local reporters at the Capitol covering their local delegations in a way that we'll never do, right? We're not attuned to what's happening in Athens in a way that the Athens Banner-Herald reporter is. But that started changing within a couple of years. And my story about that is, I remember one time I'd heard in the Capitol hallways buzz about some major project being developed in Augusta. And there was no Augusta reporter there to kind of tip off. And so I started asking questions, and eventually I got the governor's office to give me the scoop. And so I wrote that this giant new biotech cybersecurity center was going to be built on the banks of the Augusta River in downtown Augusta. And within like 3 minutes of that story publishing, I got some angry calls from people. There's no Augusta River. It's the Savannah River. And I quickly changed it. But that was my kind of wake-up call. Yeah, the Augusta reporter would never have made that mistake, right? The Augusta Chronicles reporter wouldn't have done that, but they were relying on me because they didn't have anyone down there. So whenever I hear from audiences around the state, I always beg them to tell their newspapers to send people to the Capitol, because it's the most important thing you can cover is what your local delegations are doing, what's happening at the Gold Dome. And you're not seeing that. You are seeing more statewide media, though. There's a robust radio presence from WABE, from GPB. The AP, I think, is back in Atlanta with at least one reporter, maybe two. You're seeing some national outlets, like I mentioned. New York Times has hired someone to be here. The Washington Post is hiring right now. Politico is probably going to hire. I keep on hearing rumblings. But they're staffing up because they realize how important Georgia is. And there's not many events I go to anymore, like the one with Stacey Abrams, where she said, I might as well just have this in your office, because now there's a ton of reporters coming to them.
Thank you. Hi, Greg. Jeffrey Albertson, we met earlier. Thank you. I have a question specifically about critical race theory and the emergence of that in the Georgia Assembly, and especially this term. Why do you think that is? Is it just a Republican policy to stir base, or is it something more complicated?
Yeah, Eric Erickson, the conservative commentator, tweeted a video today where he said, bandwagoning is never good. And what we're seeing a lot now in Georgia, and I don't have a stance on the legislation, but what we're seeing a lot in Georgia is bandwagoning, is legislation that we've seen in Texas or Florida or other Republican-led states that are being adapted and adopted here. And just yesterday was the Florida's Don't Say Gay legislation. A version of that was introduced here in Georgia yesterday. You have other pieces of legislation like critical race theory that is being proffered in Georgia. Part of it is the example from Glenn Youngkin, where Republicans saw that by focusing on education policy, you can win over suburban voters that voted Democratic in past elections. And that's what Glenn Youngkin kind of played to the T. He took advantage of gaffes by his Democratic opponent, but he also hit that sort of seam with very frustrated, upset parents. It sucked to have my kids in virtual school. I felt like it was longer than they needed to be. And I saw my then kindergartner, first grade, whatever, kindergarten and first grade. But I'd see her kicking and screaming on the floor because she didn't want to do another 2 hours of Zoom. And so we, made the decision to pull her out and send her to Davis. We kept the fifth grader in public school, but a lot of people can't do that. And so I felt like Republicans kind of hit that seam in Virginia, and certainly Brian Kemp is trying to do the same thing. Education policy is the dominant issue in the Capitol. Usually it's funding, usually it's debates over, even guns is being kind of overshadowed by debates over education policy, critical race theory. Divisive concepts is the new buzzword. Banning obscene books, banning schools from requiring masks in classrooms. Those types of things are getting a lot of the debate in the Capitol right now. And yeah, we've written it a million times. No one's teaching critical race theory in Georgia. And frankly, the latest pieces of legislation don't say the word critical race theory. They talk about divisive concepts. But what teachers worry about is a chilling effect. They're worried about being secretly recorded or getting in trouble for teaching about slavery, about race and history. And it all taps into that same thing that we were talking about earlier, with a significant number of voters, including many conservatives, feel like they're being canceled, that their views are being diminished, and that they're worried about a new kind of multiracial coalition taking the precedence from them. So those bills are going to pass, right, in some form or fashion. I'm not sure what effect they'll have on the classroom, but Governor Kemp started the session saying that he endorsed those measures. And one other thing he endorsed too, that I didn't think he ever would endorse, was the bans on transgender athletes from participating in high school sports. And that legislation's still pending, and it's still going to take different forms. But seeing the governor kind of throw that in his State of the State speech, to me, was a major moment. And I wrote a story right after David Perdue got in the race, saying that it's going to, his appearance in this race is going to kind of amp up the culture wars at the Capitol. And Brian Kemp knows that he has to continue moving to the right. He's already on the right? It's not like he's some squishy moderate. He's very conservative. One of the first things he did was sign the anti-abortion law measure, the heartbeat law, into law. So this is a governor who's not trying to play to the middle at all. But David Perdue forced him even further to the right, and he's giving David Perdue very little wiggle room to sort of outflank him. And I think that's a trend we're continuing to see with everything that Brian Kemp does.
All right, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
I have a question about journalistic neutrality.
Yes.
You work for a large paper that has a national reputation, and there are points of view by Mike Lukovich and Ramirez on one side. You got letters to the editor, some of which gall me. And you have to write a column that needs to anger both sides, I guess, of sorts, and yet also keep your job. I wonder how you, as a matter of philosophy, go about trying to maintain integrity and maintain a sense of neutrality so that we keep reading the next paragraph of what you've written.
Yeah, that is our challenge, right, in today's environment. And one of the ways I try to do it is just to be open and upfront with all the people I cover. I had to call Herschel Walker's campaign manager today and said, hey, the story, and he knows about the story because I've been telling, I've asked him for comment on it for weeks, but I said, hey, the story we've been talking about is running tomorrow. I literally said, and you're going to hate it. And he knows it's coming. He's had ample time to respond to it. And he told me back, he goes, and you're going to hate our response. And he wasn't being angry. He wasn't being, it was more of just a statement, right? Like, I said, you're going to hate our story. It's true, but you're going to hate our story. And he goes, yeah, you got us. Like, I think he acknowledges that what we're reporting tomorrow is true and factual. And he's you're going to hate our response to it, which is calling the AJC a liberal rag and all that. At some level, you've got to understand that's part of the game, I guess, is that, you're going to get called names by Republicans and Democrats when you write something they don't like. But you always try to have a professional relationship with the candidates and their campaign operatives. And frankly, a lot of the campaign operatives know that I've been there before the campaigns, I'll be there during the campaigns, and I'll be there after the campaigns. And these guys, if so-and-so loses, the losing candidate will move on, but the operatives are still in the world, in this world, so they still need to deal with people like me. So I have a professional relationship with them. I tell them, I try not to surprise them, right? I can't always guarantee because there's breaking news and things like that, but for the most part, if I'm writing a negative story about them, they'll know it, and they'll have a chance to answer it. They'll have a chance to respond. And they'll also have a chance to say, this is why this is not really, your theory doesn't work because of X, Y, Z. But also you show up. One of the biggest lessons I've learned was when you write a negative story about someone, you do everything you can to see them in person the next day so that they don't start thinking of you as some guy throwing bombs from your basement or whatever, right? Because there's a lot of reporters that will do that. And frankly, there's a lot of reporters that have to do that because they're not here. They're in Washington or New York. I'm here every day. So I see these candidates. I've known them, I've known Kemp since 2002. I've known Stacey Abrams since 2009. I've known Perdue since 2013. I've known all the candidates I'm writing about. So it's harder for them, and they've known me, so it's harder for them to just paint me as some communist, whatever. Sure, I've written stories that have ticked them off, and they might see as biased. But all those stories go through editing, go through vetting from our editors. The story that I'm talking about with Herschel Walker, it's been in the works for weeks now, and I'm impatient, so I don't like it when I want to see the story come out. But it's in the works for weeks, and no fewer than three or four sets of editors have seen it. That's before copy editors and other reporters who might look at it too. So we do our very best to be fair and neutral on these things and objective. But I'll also say that when calling Donald Trump's lies about election fraud, that's not being biased. That's also just calling things out as they are, And so I think we've seen a new approach in journalism towards being more willing to say something's a lie when it's a lie, in the end of the first Trump term, at least, right? In the end of, I shouldn't say, but in the last few years, with concerns about our very democratic integrity being undermined. So I hope that answered your question.
Anybody else? Well, then I'll take the last question. Southern Poverty Law Center came out with something this week indicating that white supremacy and anti-Semitism had sort of become mainstream. Are you seeing a shift in Georgia in terms of it becoming no longer politically inappropriate to express ideas that we would have shunned 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I haven't seen a complete shift in that sense yet. I think that's why it's important that we in the media and that people in the community call it out when we see it. And that's why it's important when Marjorie Taylor Greene speaks at a white nationalist rally where they were applauding Putin, that we report about that sort of thing. I will say we have a reporter on staff, Chris Joyner, who also just came out with a great book about a murder in West Georgia a few decades ago. But he is our, for better or worse, he's like our extremist reporter. And so he has a Slack channel that I'm on, and it's scary to look at sometimes because he'll just post random stories that he's looking at. But of all the extremism in Georgia and really in the South, and things, trends he's watching. And one of the big things we're watching is this guy, Chester Doles, who is a known white supremacist, who's running for office in Lumpkin County. And I was just in Lumpkin County at a Republican event with Herschel Walker and other local candidates, and I've known the state senator up there for years now. And Chester showed up to that event and wanted a picture with Herschel Walker. And the sheriff, the local sheriff, who's like the most popular guy in all of Lumpkin probably ever, I mean, he's this revered figure, he had to go and kind of tap Chester Doles on the shoulder and say, "You're not getting in a picture with Herschel Walker." So you're seeing community pushback in part because of the media attention. Local figures up there say that this guy has no chance of winning. I don't know, who knows? But by covering and by exposing their histories, and frankly, the same thing that you saw media members throughout the nation do with some of Marjorie Taylor Greene's past remarks, finding what she said about Jewish space lasers and all other things. That is not a story that AJC broke. I think the New Yorker broke that. So finding some of those stories, and they seem funny, but they also kind of start to put a pattern together of how she thinks and how these candidates think. And so it's up to us to sort of do that work. And it's also up to advocacy groups and the public to actually look at what the candidates' past remarks are and what their past statements are. So I haven't seen it mainstreaming in the state capitol. I will say it's a very big concern that there's only one Jewish member of the Georgia legislature, Walensky, who I went to high school with, who is stepping down. But I know Esther Panich is running. I know today, I forgot his name, but there's a Republican Jewish running against him. Who is it? Oh, no. Who's running against Esther? Peter Corman, I think it's. Anyway, there's another Republican Jewish member running. But no, it's people think Jews run the world. But at the state capitol, there's very few Jewish people involved. There's very few Jewish lobbyists and Jewish operatives. And that's why Mike played this very unique role. And I'm glad to see at least a few Jewish candidates stepping up to run for some of these seats so that we can continue to have a Jewish voice in the state capitol.
Well, on behalf of Temple Emanu-El, I want to thank you very much for being here today, and I would like to... we love having you here. Please come back again. If you get tired of B'nai Torah and you'd like to become a member here, we'd certainly welcome you. We do appreciate all the work that you do at the AJC. What you do is really vital for all of us, and we thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
And when is your book coming out?
March 22nd. You can pre-order it now. It's called Flipped.
All right. Thank you.